Welcome to the KidMin podcast with Dr. Val and Dr. Virginia, where we talk about everything KidMin
and pull back the curtain on some of the surprises and challenges in children's ministry that nobody prepares you for.
I'm Dr. Val, and together we have over 45 years of experience in children's ministry.
I'm Dr. Virginia. Valerie and I met over 10 years ago in our doctoral program at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. We are excited to share with you all the great stuff that we have picked up over the years. We want to minister to you, the children's minister.
Welcome, friends. Thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Virginia and I are going to tackle a really interesting topic, I think, in our discussion today. It's one of those things that can happen often, and we're going to be talking about how we can lead our ministry through a leadership change in the church. And this might be, we're primarily talking about if your senior pastor is changing, if there's a departure there, if there's a new minister coming in. But quite honestly, this could really include any church staff member coming or going. It can cause a lot of difficulty in transition and a lot of just stress within the church family.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly if it's a minister or a leader who's been there for a long time or had a wide-reaching impact to where their departure is visible and noticed and felt. And so how we lead our ministries through those types of seasons.
Right. Because you might think, well, this is not in the children's ministry where we're having the transition, so it's not really going to affect my ministry so much. But it honestly really does, because there is a ripple effect through the entire church whenever there is a change in culture, like the fact that somebody that's been there for a very long time is leaving, or somebody is coming in that has different philosophies, has a different style. And so not only could this be stressful for your church family and for your church, but also for you, because again, this is going to change the dynamic of your staff. It's going to change the culture of your church, because your church culture does tend to lean on how your senior pastor especially is leading your church. So it really can take you through a lot of changes that you don't expect, but that you kind of need to be prepared for, because you never know when this might happen.
Yes. And we're going to kind of walk through 3 phases of time as we discuss this. 1, when the pastor is announcing their departure; 2, being the interim period where, you're kind of in between pastors; and then 3, whenever the new pastor comes. And so we're going to talk all the way through that timeline of considerations, things to be aware of, questions you may want to ask, and just kind of how to work through that process with your ministry and with your church congregation. Right. So we'll get started. So step 1, the pastor announces their departure. Now, this could be something that is sudden and unexpected, or it could be something that's maybe been building up and leading up to that for a time. But we're going to start with talking about when it's sudden or unexpected. The congregation could be shocked that the pastor is leaving or stepping down. It could be even a sudden departure, like the pastor passes away tragically. Right. It could be accompanied by a moral failure. So there are lots of reasons, or a health crisis. There are lots of reasons that it could be sudden and unexpected for the pastor to announce that they're stepping down or transitioning away.
Yes, because especially when you're looking at situations like if it's a health crisis, or if you're looking at a situation where maybe there's a moral failure or something has happened, staff and committees tend to work really hard to keep the privacy there. So a lot of times those do happen suddenly because they have been very quiet in the preparation for it. And they're not going to give out a lot of detail. They're not necessarily, they may not tell what is wrong with the pastor, or they may not tell what has happened according to how the committee has chosen to handle it. And through our conversation today, we're really not discussing whether or not the leaving is done correctly. We actually have an
Yeah.
episode talking about if you are choosing to leave, how can we leave well?
Yeah.
So we're
Yeah.
not really talking about necessarily how is the best way for these pastors to leave.
Yeah.
So but what we are wanting to let you know is that there's a lot of different reasons and a lot of different situations that might come around with a pastor leaving. And
Yeah.
I think I've just been in ministry long enough that I've seen a lot of these things and worked with a lot of churches through these situations.
Yeah.
And I've often had situations happen and people would say, "Oh, that would never happen." And it's shocking how often things do happen. And so
Yeah.
we do need to be
Yeah.
prepared for them. And so there are times where we might not know something is coming. And
Mhm.
I mentioned earlier that I've had a lot of situations over the years in ministry, and we did have a pastor of a church that was our pastor for 31 years of this particular church who died suddenly
Oh,
and
no.
had a medical
Yeah.
crisis in the pulpit on Sunday morning.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so it can be very traumatic for
Yeah.
the church body to have these sudden announcements where where
Mhm.
your pastor may have passed away, or where there is a reason why they are suddenly being pulled and let go. And so we have to think about how traumatic those situations are for our entire congregation, especially for our
Mhm.
children. If they're
Mhm.
in the sanctuary when these
Oh,
announcements are being
yeah.
made, it can be very traumatic for them as well. And so we just want to be very mindful of the fact that even as shocked as you're feeling as a
Mhm.
staff member, that many of your congregation are going to feel that same shock and sadness.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have to be prepared to give the congregation, to give the people in our ministry room to grieve.
Right.
Um, because even if it's a situation where, again, the pastor's having a health crisis, they have cancer or something, and they need to step down, and there's no one, quote unquote, like at fault. And there's
Right.
no, you know what I mean?
Right.
It just is what it is. Like, people are
Mhm.
still going to grieve. And so sometimes that grief doesn't bring out the best in people.
No.
Sometimes if they sense a power vacuum is coming, that doesn't bring out the best in people.
No.
But still giving people room to grieve, and be sad about the outgoing
Mhm.
pastor.
Right. And that's true for the rest of the staff as well.
Mhm.
It's like you said, when you have a power vacuum, often you have people that are going to try to step up and take those spots. And so you have to be very mindful of the fact that there are people that are going to make unwise decisions during this time because
Mhm.
they are dealing with the shock and the surprise, and they're just sort of reacting. And so you're going to have the gossip, you're going to have the talking, you're going to have the
Mhm.
people that are trying to maneuver and figure out how they can do things. And so the main thing you can just do is to just be there for your people, and just be
Mhm.
prepared, to show that love and kindness and patience, because it does bring out a lot in the family, because you are a family, you're a
Yeah.
church family, and people feel very
Yeah.
comfortable there, and they feel like it's a home, and they feel ownership there. And so a lot of people do tend to just have this like knee-jerk reaction to things that might happen suddenly and unexpectedly. And so we just have to be prepared to try to be as mindful as we can of our conversation and our words and how we
Mhm.
present what's happening in the ministry and how we encourage our church family during the time.
And I think too, just reminding people, having the language and the posture that, this isn't Brother John, Brother Paul, Pastor Jeff's church. This
Mhm,
is the Lord's church. Like, this is
mhm.
Jesus's church. Like, this is
Right.
his congregation, and he will lead it. He will shape it. He will take care of it. Like, he will take
Mhm,
care of us.
mhm.
So the future, especially in the immediate wake of a big announcement, the future can seem very uncertain.
Right.
But I mean, this is Jesus's church. This is his
Mhm.
bride. This is his body. This is who he died for and who he
Right.
loves. And
Right.
so I think rooting ourselves and our conversations
Mhm.
in that truth that
Yeah.
this was never Brother Paul's church anyway. This is Jesus's church,
Right.
and Jesus is going to do as he will, and he will take
Right.
care of us because we are still his flock. We are still his bride, and he's got a plan for us. And so we just
Right.
have to patiently walk in faithfulness and in obedience as he unfolds that plan.
Right. I think you find the ways to speak the truth in love to people who are
Mhm.
around you and just take that time to listen. There are going to be a lot of people that are going to want to talk with you. And there are a lot of people that, some that are wanting to talk to you because they're wanting to process and they're needing to process. Some are going to want to talk to you because they want to try to find out information. And so they want to
Mm.
get the inside scoop of what's going on. And so, again, if we can just try to maintain our words as we're thinking through what's happening, that we
Mhm.
encourage people and just speak truthfully but lovingly and not feel like you have to tell them just everything that's going on, because
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
want to make sure that we honor the families and the people
Mhm.
that are related to the pastor and what they're going through and the kids and all the things. It's just it's a very difficult time, but you have to allow that space and allow that time. And that means that you might have to let some other things go. Like,
Mhm.
you have to
Mhm.
give everyone time to grieve. So that might not be the best time to start a new program. It might not be the
Mhm.
best time for you to even have an event. You might have to cancel some events. You might have to
Yeah.
re-look at your schedule and what you're doing. You don't want to panic the congregation by making a lot of changes. But I
Right.
think that as a staff, you do need to sit down and mindfully look at what you have coming up over the next few weeks and say, what is our bandwidth during this time? What can we
Right.
handle? Because you want to take care of yourselves as well, because it's
Right.
going to be a lot of stress and a lot of pressure. And so it's just taking that moment to look at your calendar and say, okay, are there things that can be let go for the next couple of weeks? Are there things that we can reschedule? Are there things that can wait?
Mhm. Mhm.
So that way you have that extra time to be able to meet with people that need to talk, and that you have that time for yourself too, so that you can grieve
Mhm.
and process yourself.
Mhm. And another thing to be aware of in these times of sort of surprise or transition is that we'll also often see a turnover in church membership.
Yeah. Yeah.
And things may kind of hold steady for a little while, and it may be, who knows, it could be a mass exodus, it could be a steady trickle.
Right.
But a lot of times, especially with a transition in senior leadership, people take that as an opportunity to, go check out other churches.
Right.
Some people may just stop going to church entirely. They may just sort of
Right.
drift out and drift away and
Mhm.
just stop coming. Some people are going to say, look, this is my church. It's going to be my
Yeah.
church regardless. I'm
Mhm.
not going anywhere.
Right.
But just be prepared that, in the wake, especially of like a sudden or surprise announcement, that there's going
Right.
to be some change, some turnover with that within the membership of the
Right.
congregation.
Well, this can bring up a lot of different feelings for a lot of different people. And it's like you said, there are some people that have been, waiting for an opportunity to
Mhm.
look for another church home. And so they use that transition as an excuse. But also sometimes that leaving, for whatever reason it might be, could bring up a lot of strong feelings. And so
Mhm.
it can sometimes be something that we don't even know is going on in the life
Yeah,
of that church member,
right.
that they just cannot handle transition well, or they could not handle the fact that they lost somebody that they considered to be, very important in their lives, and
Mhm.
a leader. And so for that, sometimes it doesn't have anything to do with you or with the church or your programs. It's
Mhm.
just strictly just how they are processing the loss.
Mhm.
And so again, it's one of those things where we just need to let people know that we love them and we care about them
Mhm.
and we're there for them, and just be as encouraging and supportive as we can, even if they are telling you that they're going to walk away for a little while.
Right, right. And that can happen under any circumstances. So we've kind of focused
Mhm.
on, what to be aware of when it's unexpected for a
Right.
pastor to transition out.
Mhm.
But sometimes it is expected. Sometimes
Right.
the pastor's been faithfully serving for 25, 30, 35
Yeah.
years, and retirement is coming, or
Right.
maybe they're making a transition to go on the mission field. And so that this has been in the works for a while. So
Right.
sometimes a pastor announcing their departure isn't unexpected. Sometimes it's coming.
Mhm.
But still people will still, grieve and be
Right.
sad and still need, space to process their feelings.
Right.
But I think as much as we can, celebrating outgoing pastors, if
Mhm.
there's no moral failure in the mix, if there's nothing like that, as much as we can, whether it's expected or unexpected,
Right.
um, showing our appreciation to that pastor
Mhm.
and giving the congregation an opportunity to have some closure,
Right.
to say their goodbyes, to share,
Right.
share their personal stories and appreciations, whether it's, an event like a reception, or whether it's, a basket with cards, thank you cards for the
Right.
outgoing pastor, however you want
Mhm.
to do that, giving people an opportunity to sort of have some closure and express their gratitude for all that pastor has done for them.
Right. It's really great if you do have that time to be able to really process that they know that it's coming, that they can,
Mhm.
you don't want that time period actually to be too long because
Right,
it can
right,
cause a lot of stress. But
right.
it is nice for you to at least have enough time so that people can say their goodbyes and so that you can
Mhm,
do something special and so that you can
mhm.
celebrate everything the church has done through their leadership. And then also have that pastor help encourage to look forward to the changes
Yes,
that are coming, into the growth that could
yes.
be coming, into all of the things that they have positive to look forward to, so that you are coming together as a church to celebrate. That is definitely
Mhm,
a lot easier to process, a lot easier to
mhm.
go through when you are prepared.
Yeah. And I think one of the things too that outgoing senior pastors can do that can be so, whenever it's coming, whenever it's expected, it's planned for. But one of the things they can do that can be so valuable is them personally preparing the congregation for their departure.
Right.
Like if the retirement is going to be next month, and
Yeah.
they can be like, I love you, I love this church, I'm going to miss you, but the Lord's going to call someone after me. They're not going to be exactly like me. They're going to be
Right.
different. We are praying for this person who the Lord's going to bring to us. We are praying
Mhm.
for the Lord to prepare them. But they're going to be different than me, and they may do
Mhm.
things differently. And I want you to love them the way that you've loved me. And so
Yeah.
I've heard outgoing pastors say that type of thing, and it's
Mhm.
so powerful for the congregation to hear,
Mhm.
because I think it gives them permission to stop grieving at
Right.
some point
Mhm.
and move on and be ready to follow the leadership of a new pastor. It's not a
Mhm.
betrayal to the old pastor. It is
Right.
a fulfillment of his last encouragement to you to welcome the new pastor well. And
Mhm.
so I think things like that can be just so valuable
Mhm.
as a pastor is transitioning out, especially again when it's planned for, everybody knows it's coming, nobody's
Right.
surprised. Like
Right.
it can be so powerful and so beneficial for the congregation.
It really can. And there are some situations when pastors are choosing to leave that you have a feeling that you know that it's coming, especially if
Mhm,
they're leaving because they're transitioning to another church, to another city,
mhm,
or maybe if they're choosing to move to another position within the denomination or something like that. A
mhm,
lot of times you might have felt that discontent or that sense of
mhm,
urgency to move as,
mhm,
time has gone on, and so it might not be a huge surprise, but it is something where, your church body is sort of already kind of prepared in their heads, knowing
yeah,
that they felt like that the pastor was ready
yeah,
to move on. And so there's all of these different things that can happen that's going to affect, because how the pastor chooses to leave is
mhm,
really going to affect the way that the church body is going to respond to it. So if a
mhm,
pastor is upset with something and he's choosing to
mm,
leave because he doesn't like the way something's been done, and he
mm,
makes that a statement as he's leaving, or if he is
yeah,
choosing to be involved somewhere else, and so he's sort of, kind of doing the change quickly because he's desiring to do something differently, there can
mhm,
be a lot of pain and hurt in the congregation when those things happen, because they feel betrayed or they feel abandoned or they feel left.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
you really have to read carefully the way that your congregation is accepting the news from the
Mhm.
pastor, whether it was planned or
Mhm.
not planned, or whether he prepared or didn't. But every situation is going to bring up different feelings and different
Yeah.
responses. And so you do have to sort of be prepared to listen a lot and see how is your church handling the news so that you can, kind of process it yourself, but also help them process through the time.
All right. So there comes a day though when it is the pastor's last day, the office is cleared out, pastor's gone. Then we move into what we call an interim period, which is the time between, your first pastor and when you call the new pastor or the new pastor comes. And so that process of getting a new pastor can certainly vary pretty widely by denomination.
Right.
Our experiences are in, more sort of Protestant evangelical churches where it's like the church calls a new pastor. Typically, you go through a pastor search process with a committee. And so that's sort of been our background, and our experience has been, you have a committee who vets the applicants and the candidates, and then they, call whoever it is that they are nominating to be your new pastor.
Right. And this
So,
can vary a lot, like you said,
mhm,
in denominations and in different faiths, where you might have, if your church is a committee-led church where, the committee does take that lead and moves forward. If it's a staff-led church where the staff is the one that's responsible for doing the calling of the new pastor, so they're the ones that'll be doing that work. Or if you have your denominational leadership
mhm,
actually makes those choices and determines the placement of pastors. And so there's a lot of different ways that it can
mhm,
happen. The thing that can be really difficult, and just to kind of say that this happens sometimes the staff is not involved at all. If you
mhm,
do have a committee-led church where the committee is the one that's responsible to do all of the search and the interview and the decision making about whether or not someone's coming or not, a lot of times the staff is not included in that. And so that can bring a lot of
mhm.
stress for the staff because you
Yeah.
are kind of out of the loop and don't exactly know what's happening. So
Mhm,
there's a lot of different ways that this can go. And so, it really varies according to your church and according to your church tradition. Like, what is it? How is it
mhm.
that your church calls new pastors? So, yeah, it can be very, very different according to the church that you're a part of.
And however that selection process takes place, just like what you're saying, particularly if it's by a committee or if it's, higher up denominational leadership, it's hard because this new pastor who's coming in, yes, they will be your pastor, but they will also be your boss.
Right.
And so I think a lot of times, especially with committees of lay people who have never served on a church staff,
Mhm.
don't always understand that dynamic
Right.
that, we're not just calling our pastor, but there's this whole group of people for whom he's going to be,
Right.
their head, their week to week, day to day, leader and head
Right.
boss. And so, that's an interesting dynamic
Right. Right. Right.
to be waiting on a decision from a committee for, yes, your pastor, but also your boss.
Mhm.
And typically, what I've found is that process tends to be very, very quiet,
Yes.
leading up to either an announcement or a prospective pastor coming to preach and be voted on.
Mhm.
It tends to be very, very quiet because they understandably want to go about that process with respect to the candidates,
Right.
because the candidates may not be ready to tell their home church or
Right.
even their own children that they are
Right.
considering a
Mhm.
transition or considering a change. And so,
Mhm.
so oftentimes that process is very, very quiet.
Yes.
leading up to the selection of a candidate or the selection of a new pastor,
Right.
which can be nerve-wracking and sometimes long.
Very. It can be long. That was one of the things I was about to say, is that
Mhm,
the interim period could be incredibly short, because if your
mhm,
pastor is aware of the transition, like if he's
mhm.
retiring, if he knew that
Right.
he was going to be leaving, he could have been working with the committee for a very long time and they just haven't told anybody. And so when he makes his
It's just been
announcement,
quiet. Yeah.
they may be ready to move the next person in almost immediately, or at least they will have the interim pastor. If you have
Mhm,
a situation where you might have an interim pastor come in, and those interim
mhm,
pastors can be anywhere from they are coming in and they're doing everything that the senior pastor did before, which means that they are
mhm,
technically your boss for a while, or an interim pastor could just be coming in on Sunday mornings to preach and then leaving, and they're not
mhm,
going to be running the staff. So you have that as well, that you're thinking about, okay, what is this interim period going to look like? Who is going to be
mhm,
the one making the decisions? Who is the one that's going to be leading staff meeting? Who do we go to when we have issues? It's finding your bearings with what's going to be
mhm,
happening within this congregation, but also what's going to be happening within your church staff
mhm,
and in your
mhm,
day-to-day process, those people who are in the office every single day. And
mhm.
so it can be a challenge. So that can happen very quickly, or it might take years, because you have to realize
Yeah.
too that committees are lay people who are not doing this for their full-time job. So they have to work searching
Sometimes
for a
they move
pastor around
very
their schedule.
slowly.
And
Yeah.
oh my gosh, sometimes they take forever.
Yeah.
And so, you just have to be
Yeah.
prepared. You have to be prepared that your interim period is going to be very stressful.
Yeah.
You need to make sure that you are doing a lot of self-care and that you are protecting yourself. And because it could be a very long time, and it is very
Mhm.
stressful because you don't know what's going to
So
happen.
yeah, so just to piggyback off of what you're saying, yes, interim periods can definitely last for a very long time. So the ones that I've been in have been on the short end about 10 months and on the long end about a year and a half.
Right.
Um, but I like your point about interim pastors during the interim period as well.
Mhm.
Um, I've been at churches where, in particular, we've had what we call intentional interims,
Mhm.
where the interim pastor isn't interested in being considered for that senior pastor role. They
Right.
are specifically coming in to be an interim, and those intentional interims are there specifically to be kind of a buffer in
Mhm.
between the last pastor and the new pastor. Because whether it was the outgoing pastor was there for years and beloved,
Mhm.
and everyone loves this person, is going to miss them, or if it was a situation where the outgoing pastor even left on a sour note for one
Right.
reason or another, that intentional interim creates a buffer
Right.
between the last person and the new person. That way, the new pastor who comes at the end of
Mhm.
this interim period, once they're selected, they aren't immediately and as closely compared to the last pastor, for good or for bad.
Right.
And so that interim pastor kind of creates some space in people's minds and memories and hearts in between the previous pastor
Mhm.
and the new pastor. And
Mhm.
just like what you said, an interim pastor can be anything from showing up on Sunday morning to preach and that's it,
Right.
or all the way to leading staff and being on campus every day and really holding that role of the pastor.
Right. Right.
And so that interim pastor during the interim period really does have an important role to play.
Yes.
And if
Mhm.
they can step into that role with intentionality
Mhm.
and lead well, that can really be a benefit to the congregation. And
Right.
one of our
Right.
interims, what was fun, like he capitalized on being an interim in a way that was humorous but clear and direct.
Mhm.
Like he would make jokes or he would just say things. He'd be like, I can say that. I'm the interim. I'm going to be gone in a few
Right.
months
Right.
anyway.
Right.
Or, I'm just the interim. Like, I
Right.
want you guys to love your next pastor. I want you guys to listen to your next pastor. I want you guys to, follow his leadership. And so,
Right.
so whenever those interims come in well prepared, it
Mhm.
can be such a benefit to the congregation.
It really can. But also, I've always told leaders to be very cautious during that interim period because you might have this like idea of something that you've always wanted to do that maybe your
Oh,
previous pastor didn't want you to do. And when you go to the interim, they're like, yes,
yeah.
go for it. And you make these changes. But the thing you have to remember is you have another pastor coming in
Yes.
that you are not familiar
Yes.
with. And we're going to be talking about
Yes.
some more specifics about that in a few minutes. But during that interim period, it might be exciting to think, ooh, I can do all of these things I've always wanted to do that I couldn't do. But you have to be very careful because if you have the new pastor coming in, they may say, no, we're
They
going
may
back
have
or pull back.
their own ideas. Yeah.
Right. And so you may make a
Mhm.
change and then have to make another change. And if you have too many changes, you're going
Mhm.
to overwhelm your church
Mhm.
family,
Mhm.
especially your volunteers.
Mhm.
And so the interim pastor may come in and say there are some things that need to be done, like maybe safety and security things that they see that they feel are necessary. So it's not that you don't want to make any changes if there are some changes to be made, but you want to be
Mhm.
very mindful that changes during the interim need to be as few and as small as possible because you really don't know what's coming. And so
Mhm.
you again don't want to overwhelm your volunteers. So trying to keep things as much of a status quo as you can because
Mhm.
there's so much other change going on around you. It's just going to overwhelm everyone if you get too excited during that time.
Well, and definitely during the interim period, we want to just keep the ministry operating smoothly.
Mhm.
Just like what you said, we don't want to start new projects
Right.
because we also, going back to the whole, people may be trickling out of our church during this period.
Right. Right.
We could have key leaders transitioning out of our ministries and out of our churches at really inopportune times.
Mhm.
And so, we just need to keep our ministries running smoothly
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
continuing without trying to add anything new or different or make any huge changes. Because
Right.
something that we may also see in interim periods as people are trickling out would maybe a dip in finances. And that can get scary.
It can.
But again, just keep being obedient and walking in faith and keeping your ministry running smoothly.
Right.
Um,
Right.
because one of the most valuable things that we can do as a church staff during an interim period, during a time of transition, is to provide a sense of stability in
Mhm.
other areas of the church.
Right.
Because if we can provide stability and consistency in the children's ministry, in the student ministry, in the music
Mhm.
ministry, in the adult ministry, then that gives people a sense of just comfort and
Right.
safety that even though the senior pastor is transitioning
Mhm.
within these ministries within the church, things are stable, things are running smoothly, things are continuing. And so this is a safe place for me and my
Yeah.
family to continue because these leaders in these other areas, they are doing a good job taking care of their ministries, even in the
Right.
midst of transition.
Right. Well, you because usually during these transition periods too, there'll be a lot of other transitions that happen
Mhm.
within the church staff and within the church family because we've already talked about other, members choosing to leave during this time.
Mhm.
But I've also seen a lot of staff leave during interim
Mhm.
periods because they feel this opportunity of like, okay, right now is a good time for me to make this transition that I've been
Mhm.
wanting to make. Literally,
Mhm.
my very first internship, when I first decided to go into vocational ministry, when the senior pastor decided to leave, everyone except for the preschool and children's ministers, everybody else on the staff left. And so
Mhm.
literally they
Mhm.
lost the entire church staff
Mhm.
except for those two ministers. And
Mhm.
so it brought a lot of chaos and a lot of
Mhm.
stress, not just to those of us who were still, trying to hold everything together and trying to work on everything, but also
Yeah.
just for the congregation. A lot of the people just didn't know what to do. It was just a panic
Mhm.
feeling. And so we did lose a lot of members then. And we also didn't get a lot of new people coming in during that time because nobody wants to
Mhm.
visit a church when there's not a senior pastor. because you have
Right.
that sense of you don't know what the church is going to be like in a few months. And so either they'll say, well, we'll come back and visit later, and then usually don't. Or they decide,
Yeah.
this is not a church for us right now because we want to find something that's a little more stable. So, there's a lot going on during that interim time in a lot of churches.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned the whole turnover. I'm sort of on the other side of that with a senior leadership change at my current church, where the majority of us on church staff have been there, with the exception of one person,
Uh-huh.
have been there for, a year to 2 years.
Right.
Because just like what you're talking about, and again, nothing nefarious or,
No.
or, no ill intent, but, whenever the previous senior pastor retired, you
Right.
know, the rest of the staff just kind of, for various reasons and personal
Mhm.
reasons, really nothing to do with the church,
Right.
moved on to different roles. And
Right.
so I'm on a staff now that currently is, a lot of us are new, but we've
Mhm.
kind of gotten through sort of the initial change phase and
Yeah.
are on the
Yeah.
other side of that and are just like plugging ahead.
Yeah. Yeah.
so,
Yeah, it's
so
just it's
yeah,
it's just a lot, and so that's
yeah,
one of the reasons why we say, "Let's just hold off on any other
yes.
changes because you don't know what changes are coming around the corner." Because again,
Mhm.
if your other staff
Mhm.
members are thinking about leaving, they're not gonna be talking about it
Yeah.
until they're ready to announce it.
Right,
So it's
right.
gonna be something that's gonna be very surprising for you. So
Mhm.
again, you just wanna
Mhm.
try to keep things as calm and as comfortable as you can as
Mhm.
all of this is kind of going on around you, especially for the kids, because the kids can
Yeah.
feel the stress, they can feel the
Mhm.
transition, and so you want to
Mhm.
be that stabling force for them.
Mhm. Yeah, and especially and sometimes too, whenever, a senior pastor or senior pastor and other staff members are transitioning out, sometimes they're taking with them, their wife who serves in the children's
Right,
ministry or their children who
right,
are a part of the ministry. And
right.
so
That's exactly
as
right.
the senior pastor transition is happening, potentially with other transitions, you could be losing volunteers and kids in your ministry. And so that could have a much deeper ripple effect in your ministry than what you originally anticipate.
Right, right. So many times as our interim would be, coming into the church at the beginning, they would always have that conversation of, "We're just the interim, I'm just the interim. I am not gonna be your new pastor," not and then within a couple of months, we find out that they're gonna be the new pastor. So you kinda just never know when something's gonna happen with an interim.
Ah.
It just makes life interesting.
So eventually, though, our interim period will come to an end. The
Yes.
Lord, through whatever the means, whatever the processes are, will send a new pastor.
God is
And
faithful.
so
It
now
will
it's
happen.
time to prepare for the new pastor transitioning in, preparing ourselves, preparing our ministries.
Right.
When the new pastor comes, we want to be supportive. And we
Mhm.
also need to expect some level of changes and differences from
Right.
the previous pastor.
Right. Everyone is told, and I tell leaders this, and everyone is told when you come into a church, you need to get to know people. You don't need to change things too quickly. You don't need to,
Mhm.
but typically with senior pastors, they come in, they've already told the committee what they see as the future of your
Mhm.
church, and they've
Mhm.
already like started to plan on what they think is going to be best. So a lot of times senior pastors will come in with change ready to go. And so they hit the
Mhm.
ground running the minute they walk into that office. And a lot of them will have a plan in mind. A lot of them will bring new staff with them. So
Mhm.
when you have this new pastor coming in, you can expect that there's going to be a lot of change.
Mhm. And as much as you can, especially in the early days of the new pastor coming,
Mhm.
being very supportive of the new pastor. Because again,
Mhm.
it's hard, regardless of how the last pastor left, whether they were beloved and they left on great terms,
Right.
whether it was a mess and they left and it was very rough. Regardless of how the last pastor left, it's hard to walk into a pre existing ministry with
Mhm.
people who have their own expectations, with people who have
Mhm.
their own assumptions, with people who have their own ideas. And so, whatever we can do as ministry leaders to help that pastor transition in smoothly,
Right.
it especially helps if you've had an opportunity to meet the pastor, to talk with them,
Right.
to get a feel for them beforehand. That way, you can have those conversations with your key leaders within your ministry. Be like, hey,
Mhm.
I am so excited about Pastor Bob coming in.
Right.
He has a great heart for children. He has a heart for families. Like, this is what he's excited about. He loves our ministry.
And
It's going to be, the Lord's got wonderful days ahead of us
right.
under the leadership of Pastor Bob. And so, you want to be authentic and genuine and true in what you say, but the more you can help this new pastor transition in well,
Mhm.
by laying groundwork within your ministry that is positive, supportive,
Yeah.
encouraging of the new pastor. That's going to help them transition in well, and you're gonna
Mhm.
have their back, because ultimately they are your leader, the leader of your
Yeah.
church, the leader God has placed in your congregation, and
Mhm.
so you want to have their back and be supportive of them really from the get-go,
Mhm.
to try to help them transition in well and get started well for the
Mhm.
good of the whole church, for the good
Mhm.
of the whole church body, to be accepting and to weather this new change well.
Mhm. Right. Because you do need to be prepared because a new leadership style is coming in. Even if
Mhm.
they are very similar to your previous pastor, they are still
Mhm.
going to be a different leadership style because they're going to be their own. They're going to have their own
Mhm.
leadership style. And so what you want to do is to sort of be prepared for what might be coming. You want to
Mhm.
be sure that you are welcoming the new pastor and that you are encouraging people, but you also want to be very
Mhm.
prepared for how you need to respond
Mhm.
because you may have a very hands-on new pastor who really wants to know
Mhm.
about your ministry and wants to know about your vision and wants to know what's working. And then you may have a new pastor that comes in that's actually the opposite, who
Mhm.
trusts you to run your ministry and just says, what you're doing, you just go for it. But that interim time is a good time maybe for you to sit back and kind of look at your mission and your vision
Mhm.
statements and have the information prepared. So if that new pastor does walk in and say, hey, do you have something that can tell me about your numbers and your vision and what you
Mhm.
do here? So you have that material ready for them so that you can present your ministry well for the new pastor coming in so that you're prepared for those conversations.
Mhm. Absolutely. And then also, as your new pastors coming in, they may be, they may have a young family, they may have children who are in your ministry. And so making an effort to welcome these children in,
Mhm.
giving their particular small group teachers kind of a heads up about, okay, you know, here's Pastor Bob coming in, and his kids Jimmy and Sally are going to be in your class, and
Right.
trying to facilitate a warm welcome for the new
Mhm.
pastor's children as well, if they have
Right.
children in your ministry area.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. New pastors definitely come in different ways.
Mhm.
And some come in wanting to do things differently. Some come in wanting to maintain the status quo until they've been there for a little while. But I mentioned earlier, sometimes they will come in with their own staff. Like they
Mhm.
do bring people with them that they have trusted and that they know well. And I've also worked with a lot of churches that when the new pastor comes in, they want to meet everybody and make sure that everybody is a good fit for their leadership style and what they're
Mhm.
looking for. So it's not been unheard of for new pastors to come in and ask staff to literally turn in resumes and to actually interview for their positions again. So
Mhm.
you want to make sure that you are prepared because that might be the style of the new pastor coming in. You just sort of have to make sure that you are prepared for all of these kinds of transitions that might come. And that you,
Mhm.
like I said before, that you know your ministry well and you know your goals well and your vision well so that you can articulate that well to the pastor coming in and know that
Mhm.
God has a plan. God has a purpose, and He is faithful, and He is sovereign. And so it can be really, really stressful waiting for these new pastors to come in to see what's going to happen. But you just keep doing what you do. You keep leading your kids, your families. You keep showing that strong leadership style that you have, and you walk in with confidence that God has placed you there for such a time as this.
Yeah, because it goes both ways. We talked about during the interim period, sometimes, staff members will choose to transition out during that time. Sometimes whenever a new pastor comes in, they will have a desire to bring their people with them,
Right.
to bring in, particular staff or particular people with whom they have a relationship and they work well. And so a lot of staff transition can happen during the interim period.
Yes.
After a new pastor comes, a lot of transition can happen during that period for a whole host of reasons, a whole variety of reasons. And so just being faithful to do and obedient to do whatever it is God has called you to do today.
Right.
Walking in that faithfulness and that obedience, not living in fear of, what might happen.
Right.
But walking in faith and just trusting that God will take care of you, and He will take care of your ministry through that whole process. So,
Right.
and so sometimes you may find yourself in a position where the new pastors come in. Maybe you've been working with the new pastor for a period of time, and maybe you begin to have questions or reservations or concerns about the pastor's theology or ministry philosophy or changes that they're making, decisions that they're making, the ways that they're leading. One, I would encourage you to not be too quick to get too worried. Give the new pastor time to settle in, give time for these changes to settle. Because it's a lot of change for everyone, because it's a whole new church for them as well.
Right.
A whole new congregation, a whole new staff. And so they're trying to find their footing as well. Anytime you do have concerns or questions, don't hesitate to ask them. Get clarification, ask your questions, try to make sure you understand, the perspective, of your new pastor. But also in your own heart and mind, kind of have those hills that you're going to die on.
Right.
We've often talked about
Right.
safety and
Oh,
security.
yeah.
It's like a hill that we will die on.
Right.
And
Right. Yeah.
So sometimes you may find that just like we're talking about with these, everyone leads differently. Your new pastor is going to come in and lead differently than the last pastor. And so
it's very true, because sometimes when the new pastor does come in, and we do have these hills that we are choosing to die on. And like I said, those are usually safety and security and doctrinal, but each one of us has our own hill that we're going to die on. And that means that we have the things that we feel called by God to do. And sometimes those things don't match with the leadership style or with the plans that a new pastor might have. And so, what you really do have to very prayerfully decide, is this where God has you for this time? Or is it time for you to move on to a different ministry or to a different calling, or to whatever God has for you? And so it's something that you want to really prayerfully consider. It's like you said, you want to give yourself plenty of time for this. You don't want to have an emotional reaction, and we can tend to have an emotional reaction. It's just human nature for when something like this to happen. If we're not getting along with the new pastor, or we don't agree with what's happening, it's really easy to want to immediately say, okay, we're out, or we have to change this, or I have to say something. And I think that the greatest advice from my experience, because I've done it all, like I've reacted all the ways. And I think that for me, looking back, wishing that maybe that I had taken more time, that I had prayed longer about the situation, that I had found more careful ways to state my concerns. There are a few times that I wish that I could go back and say, oh, I wish I had voiced my concerns in a different way, because I would get so passionate and so excited and so scared and so nervous that I would jump in. And so it's finding that time so that you're prayerfully considering that you're going to your mentors, that you're going to the people that you trust, and you ask them, am I responding correctly to what's being said and what's being done? Or am I overreacting? Am I not seeing something? Am I missing something? And allowing people to speak into your life in that way for them to be able to look at you and go, oh, no, that's not right. Or, oh, well, have you thought about this? It's nice to have those
Yeah.
voices that are outside of your church. That's where we talk, we talk a lot about mentors and finding those leadership people. And so I think it's finding ways for you to really step back and make sure that there isn't something that you can do, but also realizing that sometimes people are just different and styles are different and people are called to do different things. And so maybe this is God leading you to make another decision, that maybe this is not where you need to stay. And it's okay if that's the way God is leading you. You don't want to let yourself feel guilty about that, because that may be very well what God is doing. He may be very well leading you to another place in this situation. And so, you want to be respectful and you want to take time. But again, if it's one of those hills, if it's something that you've said, I cannot in good conscience continue here, then it's time for you to walk away, and you need to be okay with that and know that people are going to respect that. And that's where that leaving well comes in that we talked about earlier. We've got that episode on how to leave well, because you don't want to leave in a negative way, because you want to remember your families and your kids that care about you and that are there for you. So you want to definitely be prayerful and be sure that you're going to choose to leave well, however that might be. And so I think that that's really important. Transitions are hard. Any transition is hard. But when you have a spiritual leader and that is changing, that person is leaving, you have new leadership coming in, because it's like we said at the very beginning, this is not just your church family and your spiritual leader, but it's also your boss. It's who you answer to and who is in charge of the future of your ministry. And so it is a lot to take in and a lot to process, but you definitely want to remember that God is in control and that it is God's mission, and we want to do what God has called us to do. And so that has to ultimately be our priority.
Amen. And as you are obeying the Lord and following his will for you and following, his will and his plan for your ministry, one thing that can be very beneficial within the first 30 to 60 days of a new pastor being in your, in your church, in your congregation, is to sit down and have a kind of state of the ministry meeting where you lay out, just like what Valerie was talking about, lay out your vision for the ministry, lay out your numbers, your volunteers, your key leaders, strengths, weaknesses, valuable institutional knowledge about your children's ministry. So your new pastor may seek you out to do that, to have that sort of meeting. And even if they don't, I would encourage you to initiate that sort of meeting, just 30 minutes to sit down and acquaint your new pastor with your ministry, the people in it, and its history. That way they can get a good feel for what's going on in this particular area of the church.
And I think that that's a good time, because even if your leadership chart in your staff is not that you report immediately to the senior pastor, sometimes that senior pastor might not schedule that meeting with you because they don't consider themselves to be immediately over your position. It's still, I think, a great idea for you to try to have that opportunity to share with them what you do and who you are, to begin having a relationship where you can let them know a little bit of your personal life and a little bit of your ministry. And then also just to ask them for any feedback. Is there anything that they would like you to think about, so that you can show them that you're very willing to work with them and that you are respecting them and that you're showing them that you are wanting to be a team player in your staff. And so I think it's a good way to just ask for a few minutes just to have that little interaction, because especially if you're on a large staff, that can be hard to find that time. So if you can make that happen pretty quickly, at least then you have that opportunity to start a relationship there. Like I said, this can be very stressful and it can be very difficult. And there's so much that's going on. And there's a lot of fear and a lot of unknown and just all of the things that go along with transitions and change. And we just want you to know that we are just wanting to encourage you during this time that you trust God and his plan, that you trust his leadership and his calling in your life. We want our pastor to come in to a strong church and a healthy church and a ministry that just really focuses on the love of God and bringing people in to know Jesus more. And so we just hope for you that you are able to weather this transition well, and your leadership is going to grow through this transition.
Yeah. Amen.
And that you can just try to focus on the positive, even in the middle of all the chaos. We are just so thankful that you took time to spend with us today. We are so very grateful for you. We are praying for you. We are thinking about you. We are constantly trying to find new ways that we can meet you where you are. So please don't hesitate to send us a note, to send a comment, to send an email. Let us know what you're thinking about, what you're concerned with. How can we help you? Because that is our heart. We hope you have a wonderful week, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. Bye-bye.